The morning sun cast a golden glow over Florence, but inside the church of San Pancrazio, a different kind of light was about to break. It was 1808, and the church, once a sacred sanctuary, had been stripped of its holiness. The air was heavy with the smell of damp stone, and the silence of a forgotten place. But in the family's burial chapel, a large, almost square altarpiece still stood, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to the decaying walls around it. The painting, created around 1485, depicted the Virgin Mary nursing the Christ child, seated in a serene landscape between Saints Jerome and Dominic. On either end of the predella, the Rucellai coat of arms proudly displayed the family's heraldry. For over 300 years, this altarpiece had been a cornerstone of the Rucellai family's legacy, a testament to their wealth and piety, but times had changed. The church, now deconsecrated, was no longer a place of worship. The altarpiece, a masterpiece by Filippo Lippi, was carefully removed and carried to the front of the block, where it was installed on the piano nobile of the Rucellai Palace. The family's decision to move it was a symbol of their resilience, a way to preserve their heritage in a world that was rapidly transforming. Yet, the altarpiece's journey was far from over. In 1857, Giuseppe Rucellai, the same man who had rented out the first floor of the palace to foreign visitors decades earlier, made a difficult decision. He sold the Lippi altarpiece to the National Gallery in London for £627. The sale marked a significant moment in the family's history, a moment when the weight of financial need outweighed the value of cultural heritage. The painting, with its pristine provenance, was packed up and sent to a new home, leaving behind a void in the Rucellai Palace and a city that was beginning to feel the strain of change. Florence, once a center of Renaissance art and culture, was now a city in transition. The aristocratic families, including the Rucellai, were selling off their ancestral treasures to dealers and collectors. The market for these family relics was booming, and the city was dubbed the capital of bric-a-bracdom by the antiquarian James Jackson Jarves. He described the scene in the 1880s, where noble families, once guardians of the city's artistic legacy, were now turning their homes into makeshift galleries. Palaces that once housed generations of art and history were now filled with the echoes of mercantile shrewdness and the footsteps of eager buyers. The Rucellai family was not alone in this transformation. The market was flooded with objects of all kinds: tapestries, wedding chests, furniture, bronzes, ceramics, and stucco. Dealers like Stefano Bardini were at the forefront of this trade, catering to a growing demand from foreign collectors. The English, who had been collecting Italian art since the mid-19th century, were soon joined by the Americans, who brought a new level of enthusiasm and resources to the market. One of the most prominent figures in this cultural exchange was James Jackson Jarves, an American expatriate and art critic. In 1881, he wrote an article in the New York Times praising Giovanni Rucellai, a 15th-century Florentine merchant, as the ideal Florentine. Jarves saw in Rucellai a model for the new American millionaires men like Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and John D. Rockefeller. He urged these merchant princes to follow Rucellai's example, to use their wealth to support the arts and create cultural legacies of their own. Jarves himself was a major player in the art market, having amassed a significant collection of Tuscan and Umbrian paintings, which he displayed in his Florentine home, the Palazzo Guardianship. He saw the potential for American collectors to transform the cultural landscape, just as the Renaissance merchants had done centuries before. But the market was competitive, and Jarves had to contend with other advisor dealers, such as Bernard Berenson, who were also facilitating the sale of Renaissance art to American clients. Despite the enthusiasm of some, not everyone shared Jarves' admiration for the Renaissance. Mark Twain, in his travelogue, The Innocents Abroad, humorously criticized the period, asking, "Who is this Renaissance? Where did he come from? Who gave him permission to cram the Republic with his execrable daubs?" For the average tourist, Florence was a city of contrasts. The streets were bustling with kiosks and street vendors, catering to the growing number of middle-class visitors. By the turn of the century, Florence had become a popular destination, and the city was well equipped to handle the influx of tourists. Sigmund Freud, who visited in 1896, noted the noise and chaos of the city, but the experience was different for each visitor. E.M. Forster's character Lucy Honeychurch, in A Room with a View, was a typical tourist, following the well-trodden paths and buying souvenirs to take home. She visited the Elinari shop, where she purchased photographs of famous artworks, including the Palazzo Rucellai, a symbol of the city's rich history. The Palazzo Rucellai, designed by Leon Battista Alberti and completed in 1451, was a key landmark in Florence. Its unique combination of rustica and pilasters made it an architectural marvel, and the nearby Cappella de Rucellai, with its marble imitation of the Holy Sepulchre, was a testament to the family's piety and artistic patronage. But for Lucy and many others, the city was a stage on which they could play out their own adventures and create their own memories. As the 19th century drew to a close, Florence's skyline was changing. The medieval bell towers and Renaissance domes were joined by the Tempio Maggiore Israelitico, a Moorish-style synagogue, and the Russian Orthodox Church, with its colorful onion domes. The city, once a homogeneous bastion of Renaissance art, was becoming a melting pot of cultures, a reflection of the changing world around it. In the heart of Florence, on the elegant Via della Vigna Nuova, stood the grand Palazzo Rucellai. Its grand piano nobile was home to one of the most vibrant and eccentric characters of the early 20th century, Contessa Lysina Rucellai. Born a Cossack in Russia and transplanted to Italy, Lysina was a force of nature, known for her fiery red hair, impeccable posture, and a pungent breath of garlic, which she believed was the key to eternal youth. Lysina's presence was magnetic. She would sweep into a room, her arrival announced by her yipping Pomeranians, Fifi and Felix, and her unmistakable scent. Harold Acton, a British historian and connoisseur, was particularly drawn to her, describing her as the most strikingly Russian of the Russians. Despite her advanced age, Lysina was a whirlwind of energy, dancing waltzes and tango teas that drew the elite of Florentine society. The pre-war years were a time of glittering parties and grand balls. Lysina's tango teas in the Sala Principale of Palazzo Rucellai were the talk of the town. She would send out unassuming blue invitations, but the parties themselves were anything but. Guests were treated to lavish spreads of food, an endless flow of champagne, and a night of wild dancing that often lasted until dawn. The neighborhood oglers were fascinated by the sight of beautifully dressed women arriving at the palazzo, and once inside, the atmosphere was electric with laughter and music. Lysina's reputation extended beyond the walls of her home. She was known for her sharp wit and malicious eyes, which could convey more than words. Her memoir, Souvenirs d'une Cossack, is a chatty and often outrageous account of her life, filled with anecdotes that would shock most readers. She recounted her unusual birth, baptized with champagne in the middle of a ballroom, and her early life filled with tragedy and survival. Despite her self-proclaimed modesty, the memoir is a testament to her larger-than-life personality. One of Lysina's favorite stories involves an encounter with 3 French ladies on a train to Florence. When they disparaged the Contessa Rucellai, she revealed her identity just before they left, leaving them speechless. Lysina's life was a series of such memorable moments, each one adding to her legend. Life in Palazzo Rucellai was not without its tensions. The grandsons of Giuseppe Rucellai, who had opened the house to non-Italians, each married foreign wives. Giulio married Elizabeth Pillar von Pilchow, and Cosimo married Edith Bronson. Edith, the American, organized intellectual gatherings on the second floor, while Lysina's parties on the first floor were raucous affairs. The 2 sisters-in-law, despite their shared home, were often at odds, with Lysina famously quipping, "Family is a disease that never heals." Florentine society was a mix of the used-to-haves and the have-nots, a world of displaced nobility and aspiring socialites. Harold Acton, a younger contemporary of Lysina, navigated this world with ease, often presiding over his own salon at Villa La Pietra. Acton saw through the pretensions of the society, recognizing the faded glory of many of its members. He was particularly fond of Lysina, whose mastery of conversation and amusement had a lasting influence on him. In a society where titles were often more important than substance, Lysina's pranks and games provided a much-needed distraction. One of her most famous hoaxes involved a party for a supposed Princess Schleswig-Holstein. The guests were so caught up in the appearance of royalty that they did not realize the princess was actually a young man in disguise. The revelation brought the house down in laughter, except for the prefect of Florence, who was offended by the trick. Lysina's world was one of artifice and folly, where appearances were everything. But as the pre-war years gave way to the uncertainties of the new era, the grand stage of Palazzo Rucellai would soon go dark. Yet the memories of her lavish parties and larger-than-life presence would live on, a testament to a time when Florence was the center of a vibrant and eccentric social scene. In the early 1900s, the streets of Florence, particularly Via Tornabuoni, were bustling with social drama. Ladies avoided certain areas, like the popular Terrum Doni, where fashionable men gathered and often caused disturbances. Across the street, the Circolo degli Unioni, an old and prestigious club, had members who would stand on the sidewalk, scrutinizing and commenting on passers-by, especially women. Their remarks, ranging from dismissive to admiring, made the street an uncomfortable place to walk. Foreign women, unfamiliar with these local customs, found the behavior of the men on the two sidewalks offensive. They spoke to me about it, and I tried to explain that the catcalling, while rude, was a form of attention. However, the women were not convinced and decided to avoid the area altogether, opting instead to walk past Doni, which, despite its rowdy clientele, seemed less intimidating. One of the most famous places in Florence was Caf Doni, a hub for the fashionable and the artistic. It was a place where you could see elegant men and women, and it often felt like a scene from a fashion magazine. However, beneath the glamour, there was a darker side. Many of these men were unemployed and used their charm to attract wealthier individuals, often leading to exploitative relationships. This environment, combined with the rise of political tensions, made the atmosphere in Florence increasingly tense. Lysina, a local aristocrat, recounted the events of June 1914, a time marked by political unrest and the rise of fascism. She described the violence and chaos that gripped the city. One night, she bravely drove her Mercedes, only to have bottles of ink thrown at her windshield. The family's home, Palazzo Rucellai, faced constant threats, including an attack on their family chapel. Despite the danger, a group of young fascists, whom her servants initially accused of starting the fire, heroically saved the chapel. This incident highlighted the complex loyalties and tensions within the community. Years later, in the post-war period, Florence experienced a wave of social and economic instability. The fascist regime emphasized the need for a strong national identity and a unified society. In response, a Florentine artist named Theot created the tuta, a simple unisex jumpsuit designed to erase class distinctions. The tuta was promoted as a universal garment suitable for all occasions. In July 1920, a futurist soiree was held at Palazzo Rucellai, where guests wore personalized versions of the tuta. However, the tuta quickly became a fashion statement among the upper class, rather than a symbol of equality. The fad was short-lived, and society soon returned to its traditional ways. Lysina's life also changed dramatically after the Russian Revolution. She lost her wealth and could no longer host the grand parties that once made her home a center of social life. In 1927, her cousin, Prince Felix Yusupov, visited with a pair of diamond earrings once owned by Marie Antoinette. Despite their value, Lysina refused to keep them, citing the reduced number of servants and the risks of keeping such valuable items unattended. This moment underscored the significant changes in her life and the broader shift in Florentine society. The two pear-shaped drops encrusted with diamonds had once belonged to Marie Antoinette, the ill-fated Queen of France. The exact moment they left her possession during the French Revolution is unclear, but they stayed within the French royal family for nearly a century. In 1853, Napoleon III gifted the earrings to his wife, Eugenie de Montijo. However, after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and the couple's exile to England, Eugenie was forced to sell them. The earrings, weighing 14.25 and 20.34 carats, were then acquired by the Grand Duchess Tatiana Yusupov of Russia. Her grandson, Felix Yusupov, would later show them to Lysina on the piano nobile of Palazzo Rucellai. Felix was known for his extravagant lifestyle and cross-dressing. At 12, he would dress up in elegant women's clothing and venture out in St. Petersburg, adorned with his mother's jewels. His lifestyle only became more complex as he grew older, with numerous short-lived love affairs and a self-centered approach to romance. Felix's disdain for Grigory Rasputin, the controversial spiritual healer in Tsar Nicholas II's court, led to his involvement in Rasputin's assassination in 1916. Felix invited Rasputin to the Yusupov family's Moika palace, where he plied him with poisoned wine and shot him. Though Felix believed this act would save Russia, he was soon placed under house arrest and later exiled. Before leaving, he managed to take some of his family's most valuable possessions, including the earrings. To finance his Parisian exile, Felix sold the paintings he had taken from Moika Palace, but he clung to the jewels for as long as possible. In 1927, he visited his cousin Lysina in Florence, and still had the earrings. By 1928, however, he was forced to sell them to Pierre Cartier, who then sold them to Marjorie Merriweather Post, the wealthiest woman in the United States. In 1964, her daughter donated the earrings to the Smithsonian Institution. Lysina, a former Russian princess, pined for her lost imperial lifestyle but refused to give up her grandeur. She moved from the main hall of Palazzo Rucellai to her private salotto, where she hosted intimate gatherings for her inner circle, including Gabriele D'Annunzio and Harold Acton. She was known for her vivacity and her reputation for hosting lavish parties. Despite her fears of the Bolsheviks, she maintained her salacious reputation, often scrutinizing young men and boasting about the virility of the Cossacks. Lysina's eccentricity extended to her invitations, which sometimes carried dates from the distant past, as if she were channeling an adopted ancestor. She formed a society of like-minded friends and continued to host gatherings in her boudoir, a room filled with stuffed pets and gewgaws. Gabriele D'Annunzio, a prominent Italian poet, became her close friend and nicknamed her Monna Lisa degli Orsolari, in reference to the Rucellai gardens. Lysina's double sense of self and self-proclaimed madness were evident in her invitations and her lifestyle. In 1936, Lysina passed away and was buried in the Cimitero degli Allori, a cemetery for foreigners in Florence. The arrival of a new tenant, a princess from an undisclosed Middle Eastern country, turned Palazzo Rucellai into a bustling place. The princess, Amura, came to Florence for a modern finishing school experience, and her presence with a full domestic staff disrupted the quiet life of the palace. I tried to ignore her, but the house felt different. I continued my usual routine, exploring the palace, but found no clues to the unsolved murder that had occurred on my floor. I decided to visit the Bibliote, National Centrale di Firenze, to research the murder. The library, founded in 1714, is a vast repository of Italian works. I spent hours scanning microfilm and found numerous articles about the crime at Palazzo Rucellai. Reading about the house being labeled a crime scene made me feel violated. I returned home, still searching for answers. My preferred approach to the palace was through the smaller Umber streets, which offered their own rewards. I often visited Giovanni Rucellai's tomb, a replica of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Museo Marino Marini. Sneaking up on the palace this way gave me a sense of control, but once inside, I still felt at a disadvantage. One day I heard a commotion, and found Nico and Amura in the courtyard. Amura had knocked my bicycle to the ground, and Nico was agitated. The next day, Nico confided in me that Amura wanted to transport the entire top floor of Palazzo Rucellai back to the Middle East. The idea of dismantling the Altana, with its Paolo Uccello frescoes, seemed impossible. I reassured Nico that such a plan would never be approved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that anything was possible at Via della Vigna Nuova, 18. The cold night of January 15, 1997, was etched in the memory of Florence. Alvise di Robilant, a 71-year-old count, was found murdered in his apartment on the third floor of Palazzo Rucellai. His absence from the annual induction dinner at the Circolo degli Unioni, an exclusive men's club, had raised initial concerns, but it wasn't until the next morning that the gravity of the situation became clear. His cousin, Alurimo Scarampi, had expected Alvise to arrive at 9 a.m. to photograph a family portrait, but when he didn't show up, Scarampi grew worried and decided to check on him. Upon entering the palazzo, Scarampi made his way to Alvise's apartment. The door was ajar, and as he stepped inside, he was met with a horrific scene. Alvise lay lifeless on the floor, surrounded by signs of a struggle. The news spread quickly, and soon the headlines screamed of the murder palace and the Florentine count massacred at home. Contessa Barbara Rucellai, who lived with her husband, Count Niccolo, on the top floor, remembered the evening vividly. She had heard Alvise playing the piano, as he did every night, but this time it sounded off. She and her husband had left for a movie at 8:30 p.m., just as the piano playing had stopped. Later, at 9:30 p.m., Alvise had called Scarampi, telling him he was working on a family history book and would visit the next morning, but Alvise never made it. The investigation into Alvise's murder was intense. The police combed through the palazzo, questioning residents and visitors. The elegant facade of Palazzo Rucellai, with its intricate carvings and symbols, seemed to mock the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. For those who knew Alvise, the murder was a shock. He was a gentle, scholarly man, deeply devoted to his family's history and the preservation of their legacy. As the days turned into weeks, the community of Palazzo Rucellai grappled with the loss of a beloved neighbor. The murder cast a shadow over the building, and the once vibrant atmosphere was now tinged with sorrow and suspicion. The residents, including the professor living in the penthouse, found themselves reflecting on the fragility of life and the boundaries between public and private, history and heritage. The professor, who had been deeply involved in the palazzo's history, felt a personal connection to the tragedy. She had spent countless hours exploring the building's secrets, from the mysterious glyphs on the facade to the stories of the people who had lived there over the centuries. Alvise's murder brought to the forefront the question of ownership and guardianship. Was the palazzo a cultural patrimony, or was it a private concern? Could the concept of a public demesne be applied to such a storied building? The professor continued to ponder these questions as she sat in her apartment, surrounded by the artifacts and memories of the past. The engraving of Leon Battista Alberti, which she had found and placed on the mantelshelf, seemed to look away, just as the palazzo's history did, always containing more secrets than answers. The murder of Alvise di Robilant was a stark reminder that the past was never truly past, and that the stories of those who lived within the walls of Palazzo Rucellai were still unfolding, even in the present. As the professor prepared to leave the palazzo for a few days, she sat on the built-in bench outside, feeling a mix of nostalgia and unease. She watched as the courtyard, with its wet, sloping pavement, reflected the changing light of the day. The palazzo, with its rich history and its current residents, was a living, breathing entity, and the murder was a part of its story, a reminder of the human drama that had played out within its walls for centuries. The professor knew that, no matter where her journey took her, the memory of Palazzo Rucellai would always be with her, a testament to the enduring power of place and the inescapable weight of history.